Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is Philip Howard. I'm director of the Oxford Internet Institute, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to a talk from our wonderful colleague, Dr. Vicky Nash. For the last few years, the OII has been running a termly lecture in London to showcase some of the research and expertise we have in the department. We are a department that is multi-method, mixed method. We're about a third computer scientists and a third social scientists and a third humanists. And I think that unique combination makes us, puts us in a good position to handle some of the some of the very difficult questions that are arising as these new information technologies diffuse so rapidly and become moments for challenging the way we organize our institutions, the way we vote, the way we organize our families, the way we express ourselves. I'm delighted here to be here at the British Academy, an organization steeped in history and one that has been our host for several of these evenings, several of these wonderful evenings. Before I introduce Vicky, I have a couple of requests. First, feel free to tweet with us. I can't guarantee, tech-savvy as Vicky is, she won't be tweeting while she's lecturing with you, so she won't be responding to your tweets. But you may use OII Oxford, at OII Oxford, or the hashtag OII London Lecture during or after the lectures, and we'll all be spending some time perhaps having a drink after the talk and can pick up additional questions from our Twitter feed then, if we like. There are no planned fire alarms, so in the event of a fire alarm, please evacuate and follow staff instructions. It's a great pleasure to introduce Vicky Nash. She's a senior research fellow and the deputy director of the Oxford Internet Institute. One of the things that makes her special, and there's several things that make her special, but one of the things that makes her special is her ability to identify the particular moments that a technology arrives in family life and not only interpret the meaning of that arrival of new technology for relationships within the family union, but to interpret the impact of these new technologies for policymakers. As many of you know, DCMS has triggered an active conversation about what internet harms are. In my own particular domain, I tend to think of voting and misinformation as an aspect of an internet harm. Vicky has a very specialized and important argument to make about how we should frame the transition of our families from roughly analog organized families to broadly digitally organized families. And it probably does not peg well to the internet harms frame. The title of Vicky's talk tonight is Connected Cots, Talking Teddies, and the Rise of the Algorithmic Child. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Vicky Nash. Welcome.
Thank you for that warm and generous introduction. It's always such a lovely thing to come and be introduced by you. Before I start speaking, I have the inevitable winter cough and cold, and for those of you who remember her awful party conference and performance a few years ago, I fear I may have an attack of the Theresa Mays at some point, so bear with me, I have strepsils. So, I've spent a very long time in this field thinking about children and families and how we use digital technologies, how we relate to those technologies, what types of policy framework we need to introduce to keep our children safe, but at the same time, what types of opportunity they bring. It's been, I think it's fair to say, quite a difficult field to work in over the years. It's one that's fairly firmly demarcated for me by a degree of media-driven hype, sometimes panic, terrifying headlines like these very, very old ones actually that you see here. And I suppose as an academic, I get sometimes rather frustrated that there is not as much of a market for research-driven headlines, research-driven policy as I feel there should be. So I suppose what I wanted to do tonight is really just sort of reflect a little bit about where I think we are in terms of what we understand about how children are using technologies, what our safety advice is, whether it's fit for the future, but perhaps more importantly, whether or not we ought to be reflecting more generally on how these new technologies and the way that we use them might be reshaping some fairly fundamental things like what we understand as good parenting and what we understand as childhood. So tonight I'm going to not give you a sort of a how-to safety lecture. I have actually got several colleagues in the room who might do this far, far better than me. But I will talk a little bit about what we understand by internet safety and how I think it's being reshaped and how I think it ought to change. But I'm also going to give you a little bit of insights into how I see parenthood and childhood being reshaped. And I'm going to be a little bit provocative and ask whether or not our expectations of what it means to be a good parent are being reshaped, and whether perhaps we ought to reflect on that a little bit more frequently rather than just read quite scary newspaper headlines about whatever the latest fear is. I'm going to give this in 3 parts, a little bit of a discussion about the evolution of child safety advice. Secondly, moving on to think about that, about what it might mean to protect children in this era of what I'm calling, connected cots, talking teddies, smart devices, and what in academia we might term datafication. And then last but not least, finish up with some reflections on the future of parenting and childhood. And I should say before I start that actually the research that this is based on, in addition to being a sort of reflection on sort of all work that we've done over the last 10, 15 years, it also refers to a very specific project I undertook with the help of 2 great colleagues, Hugh Davies and Isha Bilski, who are not here, but I would thank them in their absence. So, looking around the room, I can see there's probably lots of people here who remember when the internet did look like this. Rather worryingly, not all of our students, in fact, many of our students are not old enough to remember when the internet looked like this. This is obviously the era of the dial-up modem. This is a screenshot from an ECPAT report, which is a children's charity dedicated to tackling online abuse and child trafficking. And I think this was 2002. And so at this moment, 2002, internet safety advice had to start, quite frankly, with an introduction to what the internet is, how it works. If you like that phrase, a worldwide network of computers. The internet is also home to the World Wide Web, it says, a vast series of websites, in inverted commas, which contain information which may be linked to other sites. I mean, it just sounds terrifying right from the start. In 2002, it's worth remembering quite how different things were. I mean, this is obviously largely text-based. I think it was preempted by the dancing hamster GIFs, if anybody remembers those. But in terms of internet safety, the type of content in this document was really referring to a couple of different types of risks. So one was child sexual abuse and the ways in which it was being facilitated by online news groups and bulletin boards, and also some general advice about what type of content children might encounter either in chat rooms or on websites and how parents might mitigate this. It's also worth reminding ourselves that the internet wasn't ubiquitous at this point in the way that it is now. I think 2002, I think this report stated that actually only 200 million internet users were using the internet around the world, obviously compared to the billions now. In 2005, I think that was our first Oxford Internet survey, which Bill led. We had 61% of households having internet access at home in 2005, so 2002, much less. So things were quite different. This is one of my favorite stock shots of where, I love the fact when you look at pictures of people using the internet online, they're always very happy, they're clean clothes, the family's having a joint experience, everybody's smiling, nobody's fighting over whose turn it is, nobody's cooking the dinner, etc. They're always perfect. But the thing I wanted to flag up and why I've used this picture is that, again, in those sort of early days, people used a PC, right? Look at that. That's a fairly uncommon device apart from what we have in offices. The point about the PC, as in this picture, was that it was placed often in a family room, in the hallway, in the lounge. And a common element of safety advice at this particular point was that was precisely an important safeguard, that parents could use the location of this device precisely to look at it with their children or to see what they were doing, right? So the very sort of physical nature of that PC, the fact there would maybe only be one in a house, was a core element of safety advice. Didn't rule out private activity online, but I think it's fair to say it certainly made it harder. If you contrast that with our experience of what the internet looks like now, it's obviously mobile devices, whether it's phones like here or tablets. Quite simply, since 2007, when the iPhone was introduced, things changed quite rapidly. We have really quickly, if you look at, say, 2007 to 2012, a huge change in the number of children who say that they access the internet largely alone, in private. In 2012, I think almost half of 12 to 15-year-olds, 43%, were using the internet in their bedrooms, right? So that old safety advice, the assumption that the internet is something you access together as a family, in that short time period, was changing. I think the other thing that's worth flagging up is it's not just about the nature of the device and the fact that it's mobile, that you can move it around. It was also to do with ownership. Again, something like a PC, it's a big, heavy, expensive device. You might have one, maybe you might have a couple, but you probably wouldn't have what we have now, which is a scenario where in many households, everybody has a phone. There might be some iPads as well. Some people have more than one phone, right? So there's a change not just in mobility, but also sort of level of ownership, level of access to these devices. At this point, it's perhaps understandable if we think about how safety advice changed with the advent of mobile. Necessarily, there was a look more towards online companies and their responsibilities. There were early efforts in the UK to introduce a mobile code of conduct, in particular, which ensured that you had to prove you were over 18 if you wanted anything that wasn't sort of, if you like, sort of rated for under 18s. And there was much more of a focus on how to give rules to your children or guidance to your children around things like using social media, using chat rooms, what types of behavior you should follow. But that's not necessarily any good when you move to this, right? So it's still mobile, it's still a touchscreen device. But I would argue that one of the things that we've seen perhaps in the last sort of 5 or 6 years is another important move, which is the move towards the idea of a sort of pre-literate internet user. So 3 or 4-year-olds, I don't know if you know, they're a sort of big growth area, both in terms of use of tablet devices, use of internet-connected devices, but also in terms of ownership. I think in 2018, I don't think I've seen the 2019 figures yet, but nearly a fifth of all 3 to 4-year-olds in that period have their own device, their own iPad. So it's not even just using a parent's device. And this quite obviously brings a whole array of new safety challenges. You can't give a 3 or 4-year-old simple rules to follow. You can't follow, if you like, a sort of communication-based approach where you talk about the issues that you encounter along the way. So again, thinking about how our safety advice has updated, how it's changed, it's no great surprise that with this we've seen perhaps also more of a move towards what we might term walled gardens, the demarcation of online content either through apps or services targeted at specific age groups, which will have content which, if you like, is white labeled to be appropriate for their age. So what we're seeing is the evolution of a framework for thinking about online safety. It comes from Sonia's work. It's great to see Sonia in the audience. I think that the research agenda we've had in the last sort of 10 years has continued to follow this idea that there are broadly 3 types of risk that occur to children online. Content-related risks, so things that they might see or read which are inappropriate for their age or possibly harmful. Contact risks, people that might contact them or interact with them for nefarious purposes or harmful purposes. And last but not least, conduct risks, the idea that children themselves are actors, they do things that are risky or potentially harmful to themselves. And this has been how we've sort of broadly thought about the internet safety responsibilities of parents, governments, and tech companies along these 3 lines. So what I'm going to look at in the next section is whether or not this same framework continues to be entirely adequate. Is it enough to deal with the way we are using new devices in the home? So what does internet access look like today? Well, it probably doesn't look like this so much, actually, because this doll has been taken off the market. This doll is my friend Kayla, and she is a good example of an internet-connected toy. She uses speech recognition technologies to enable a child to have a conversation with her. This requires often Bluetooth connections to a device, to an app, and then the use of that app which connects with a wider internet, whether that be Wikipedia or an online database elsewhere. I could have shown you equally pictures of soft toys, plush toys, or interactive building sets, drones that you could fly, Lego, etc. It's a really exciting market, and I know that if I was 8, 9, 10, these are the things that I would have wanted for Christmas. At the same time, it's worth noting that there are also great money-making opportunities. I believe that the market for internet-connected toys currently quite small, but expected to rise to about 500 million units being sold per year by 2022. Another type of internet access we have in the home, continuing this theme, which I should have flagged before, of being largely screenless, right? This is the Echo Dot. It's a type of personal assistant. Many of us now have these in our homes. This is a way in which many families are increasingly using the internet, not via a screen where you might type in a search term or open up an app, but where you can use your voice to ask for information, music to be played, a joke to be told, a shopping list, etc. I think at the moment we had something like 70 million of these sold in 2018. And at the moment, I think the LSE figure suggested that around about 10% of children have access to the internet using these types of device. My suspicion will be that actually we're going to see this rise quite sharply with the introduction of devices like this, which are marketed specifically at children, specifically at families. And then last but not least, a third area of expansion has been what's called baby tech. This example here is an Internet of Things device, a sensor that you place on your child, on your baby, and it will take their temperature for you. And you can look at this, you can track it over time on your mobile phone. I could have shown you all sorts of other examples, smart cot mattresses, smart pacifiers, smart bottles that track how much a child drinks and how quickly, or God forbid, even smart nappies. I think one of the suggestions as to why this is all taking off is that this is a really important market for millennials who've grown up with the internet, grown up with data-driven solutions, and expect it to be applied to parenthood in the way that's applied to every other area of life. So we're interested in these types of device because we wanted to know whether or not those 3 C's, content, contact, conduct, would be just as appropriate for understanding the types of risk that these new devices, these new data-driven, often screenless devices, might pose to children and families. We did some research funded by the Oak Foundation, and we just had a quick look, well, I say a quick look in academic terms, actually it was quite a long look, at some of the media coverage over a period of about 9 months to see what types of coverage, what types of story were being flagged up relating to online harms, online risks for children. And I'm relieved to say, at that point at least, now this is just over a year ago, it might have changed, at that point, there were no stories about these types of device being used for conduct risks or contact risks, in other words, being used, for example, to groom children, to access them remotely, which is one of the things that we were concerned about. There were a few stories about content risks. There was famously a case where Hello Barbie by Mattel was hacked by a penetration tester, and the database had swear words inserted into it so that it would speak back to a child using inappropriate language. I quite would have liked one of those, but they weren't put on sale, unfortunately. But on the whole, almost nothing to be found. So content, contact, conduct, thankfully, and this is a good thing, no coverage of examples where children were harmed using these new devices. On the other hand, what we found plenty of were stories about data and security and privacy. So stories like this. This is an example of 3 cases where companies effectively were just lax in their security arrangements at the corporate level. So databases that could be compromised, could be hacked, in the VTech and the Cloud Pets case, or companies being a bit lax about their privacy settings when it comes to actually hoovering up children's data, in that case, I think before the COPPA appropriate age of 13. This is problematic, not just simply because obviously we don't want our data exposed, we like our data privacy, but actually if you look at things like the Cloud Pets case, it was really worrying because that data was then held to ransom by the individuals that hacked it. Cloud Pets as a company didn't act in a responsible way, unlike VTech, and eventually I believe the company actually went bust because they couldn't ride through the security breach. Why does that matter? So at the end of the day, it may be discomforting to know that your child's photographs or your personal details have ended up online. But again, could we find any examples of actual harm resulting from that? Well, the answer, frankly, is no, not at the moment. Talking to colleagues in the US, this is apparently a really big issue, whereby children under the age of 18 find out that their details have been stolen and used to take out mortgages, car loans, student loans, and so on. For all that we could find at that point, it didn't appear to be the case that actually this data was coming from the types of hack that I just showed you. But I have to say, having spoken to experts in at least one government, not a UK government, literally in the last month, they feel that they have found children's data being sold online for quite high prices. And so, in other words, this, if you like, this is about the suggestion this will explode quite soon in the next few years. We just haven't seen it yet. So, identity theft is the potential harm that comes from this. In other cases, we found several examples where companies were just selling devices that themselves were insecure. So my friend Kayla, incidentally, was actually banned by both the German and the US governments, identified as effectively illegal spying devices. Barbie obviously could be hijacked to say rude things, and this most recent one, we've had smart cameras being interfered with in order for individuals to actually have access to a child's room and to speak to them. So, again, this is not necessarily leading to immediate harm for children in these cases, but what they show is a sort of lack of responsibility, a lack of corporate responsibility in the design of devices which are being put in family homes, but which don't have the necessary, if you like, the default privacy or security settings, or which use technologies which are cheap and insecure, and ultimately, which then enable these sorts of risks, data risks, to arise. The worst case that we did find, and actually this comes up periodically, so it is clearly still happening, this was a channel of hacked baby monitors, which you could just access at any point online and see into these various, 15 different children's rooms, look around the room, hack the camera, take a look. Again, it wasn't as if individuals were then using that feed to go to kidnap a child, to harm them in any way, but I do find this intrinsically very, very sinister. And, as far as I can see, the reports of this have not stopped. So at the end of the day, we have to accept that these types of devices necessarily are going to be hoovering up bits of data about us, about our children, but they're doing so whilst delivering, obviously, a huge number of benefits, whether that be around play or household utility or improved health benefits. But I guess one of the questions I suppose I find myself asking is all that data being used appropriately and proportionately? If we're going to leave these data footprints when we use these types of device, can we at least be ensured that the data will be kept securely, kept according to current privacy legislation, and that if anything does happen, that there will be responsible corporate action to deal with any sort of hacks or breaches? At the deeper level, though, I also suppose I find myself wondering whether or not this might have something quite significant to say about how we relate to our children and how children relate to their devices. So in the case of the internet-connected toys, for example, I do find there's something slightly creepy about the idea that my child is talking to a teddy bear, their innermost secrets, just like you or I would have done, their aspirations, their goals, their fears, and all that information is just being sort of hoovered up, collected, again, with a view to making it an interactive, a nice toy to play with. I'm not saying the companies are doing this with any sort of nefarious goals. But I think it's worth just reflecting on the fact that inherently these devices, they require a data exchange, and we need to be clear about whether or not we're happy with this. So for me, I guess one of the things I'm increasingly wondering is whether or not we need to get away from some of those, if you like, some of the focus on just data risks, some of the risks around contact and conduct and content, and update our safety guidance to think much more carefully about privacy and security. My worry about this, frankly, is that it's quite difficult for parents to understand what's required. If you buy a device, if you buy a toy off the shelf, on the whole, you tend to ensure that it's good to go, that it's secure. But actually, the reality is that I think we need to think a bit more carefully about how we set up things that we buy in the home. Do we use default passwords? Do we introduce our own? Do we check, for example, what the Bluetooth standard is? The majority of us probably don't. So for me, this is going to be the big leap over the next few years, and I think it's quite a significant leap. I think actually on the whole, UK families, thanks in no large part to UK researchers and the UK government, have become very familiar with the idea that you do need to have digital safety standards. But for me, the next challenge is going to be getting them up to this next level and getting parents, getting families to understand that digital safety is not enough. We also need digital privacy and security. And for this, they're going to have to learn new skills. If that's the one big policy finding or policy suggestion I suppose I have, the second is that we need to broaden our understanding of who the corporate players are in this debate. So probably like you, I'm very used to hearing about, the big five, the idea of the big tech players sitting around the table or not sitting around the table, with government thinking about how they can be, responsible players in terms of keeping children safe and enabling productive use of the internet online. But for me, the key finding I suppose I have is that those five big players, they're not enough. In many ways, we need to have more of a focus on what I would call the long tail. I could have had, 3, 4, 5, 6 different slides. This is just one to show you some of the other types of company that are increasingly delivering devices, delivering services to kids and to families, again, for really positive uses, but who ultimately, therefore, must bear some responsibilities for keeping children safe and secure online. So, again, this is my second sort of key reflection, I suppose, on the state of the debate, which is about not just upping our game, looking at safety, security, and privacy, but also improving our understanding of who the key players are that can deliver that. So on to the third part. Where do I think we're going? These changing internet uses, the nature of these new devices, the connected Cots, the talking Teddies, the smart baby monitors, the smart nappies, where is it taking us? And it's one thing to think about what it might mean for digital safety, for digital policy making, but what does it mean for parenting? What does it mean for teaching? What does it mean for thinking about the role and the place of children and families in society? So, if you work in the social sciences, it's hard to not know that. It's hard to not think about the weird idea that childhood is a contested concept. I mean, that's such a classically academic phrase. I can see people rolling their eyes at the back of the room. What we mean by thinking that childhood is a contested concept and a changing concept is really the idea that it just alters over time, right? So look at this picture. To me, this is a picture that I often use when I'm trying to present you with the sort of, the golden age of childhood. Look at these kids, they're vulnerable, they're innocent, they're playing with dolls, there's no technology around them in the modern digital sense, they're smiling, they're also sort of vulnerable at the same time. But actually, we might think of that as an enduring and permanent view of childhood. But actually, it's not the case. Even if we just think about what happens in the UK, that image of childhood has not always been what childhood meant, and never for all children, and certainly not at all times. So, we did quite happily used to send children down the mines, up chimneys, quite happy to put them into factories where maybe they might have lost fingers, they might have lost limbs. I'm not suggesting that parents, were sort of blasé about this, but that's just, how it was if you were a member of a certain social class, if your income was at a certain level, if you lived in a certain place, right? So childhood was not essentially that picture of vulnerability and fragility. Another example, again, quite recently, we tend to think that, my parents' generation will often talk about how they played in the streets after school. They didn't need digital devices. They went outside, whatever the weather. They weren't supervised by the grandparents. But look what fun they had building go-karts and playing with their friends. So again, another really appealing view in many ways of childhood. But the reality behind this picture is that, again, circumstances were different. There weren't as many cars on the road as there are now. Families couldn't afford childcare, and even if they wanted it, you didn't have wraparound childcare. So, just think, there were no TVs, perhaps, in households. There wasn't an array of devices at home to entertain to children. When you think about it like this becomes much less precious, but just understandable within the social context, the economic context in which it arose. This would probably be the reality now. If you want to think about sending kids outside, multiple cars, maybe nice parks provided by the government. But again, you couldn't send your child out to play in this by themselves. And I think we sometimes forget about this when we think about the alternatives to being at home with our devices. We tend to assume that the previous slide is actually the reality. Why are children sitting inside when they could be outside playing with their go-karts? Whereas the reality is often like this. And that's if you're lucky. That's if you live somewhere, with access to a green space, with access to a park. So, I'm not showing you those pictures to suggest that in some way there's a sort of an ideal golden age in the sort of pre-internet era where children ran free and they played on digital devices. I very clearly think the opposite. I think that the digital age has brought us and our families incredible benefits, incredible opportunities. But I'm showing you this to make you understand that just as our concept of childhood and our concept of good parenting has changed as our social and economic and technological environments have shifted, we should expect the same to happen in the next couple of decades. So where does it go? Where is it taking us? Well, I can't pretend to know, but I'm going to show you just through a few adverts where I think it's going, and then perhaps in discussion after we can think a little bit about how we feel about that. So 4 adverts for 4 types of app and service that we use. Just out of interest, how many people in the room are familiar with this? Not many, actually. That seems a bit of the demographic. So this is something called Class Dojo. Class Dojo is an app. I think in America they say it's in 1 in every 2 schools. I'm not quite sure what the UK figures are, but they're still pretty high. And it is an app that aims to provide incentives to manage children's behavior in the classroom. It also, by the way, enables parents, as you can see, bring every family into your classroom, it says. It enables parents to have a greater understanding of what their kids are doing. It gives them access to figures about their child's behavior, their child's activities on a daily basis. So it is incredible. On the other hand, think about what it's doing in order to do that. Well, it's recording digitally quite personal information about your child's behavior on a daily basis. Schools sign up to certain sets of values, which they then record a child's, if you like, performance against. It's very personal. It's not shared across the whole class. But it is still data that's being processed about your child by the San Francisco-based company on a regular basis, again, with a view to improving education, to improving family links with school. So that's the first one, Class Dojo. This is a second one. So this, I think, has been, in the last couple of years, it's won lots of prizes as one of the best online systems for monitoring and managing safely a child's social media presence and online activities. It's called BARC. It's incredible. It makes me feel very old, actually. One of the things it says is that its award-winning service proactively monitors text messages, YouTube, emails, and 24 different social networks. I can probably only name about 3. In fact, I keep meaning to find out what the other 21 are. It uses AI in a really quite impressive way to monitor for patterns of behavior within different social media, within email, within these messages, which might give you an indication that something is concerning. So, for example, if you're worrying about sexual content or sexting or cyberbullying, it would look for patterns of words, patterns of engagement that might indicate that that particular concern has arisen in your child's communications. Now, clearly, you can't use this unless you're prepared to talk to your child about it. You can't, for very long, pretend how you've had access to their online activities without showing them what you're doing. So it's not necessarily a privacy issue. But again, I can't help thinking about the level of monitoring of inherently quite private activities that this company is engaging in. You look at the data agreements, and it's quite clear, obviously, that it has access to all this data on these 24 different social networks and all these different tools and services for your child, and who knows how many other sort of hundreds of thousands. But again, read the note, read the message it gives us. It says rather nicely, it's an affordable award-winning service which proactively monitors these things so busy parents can save some time and gain peace of mind. I mean, it's just such an attractive idea. Who can not feel that you wouldn't be a better parent if you installed this on your child's device? You'd save time and you'd gain peace of mind. So it's really appealing to our desire to be that better parent. This is another one. This is a tracking device. There are many, many different tracking products out there for children. They come in the form of watches. They come in the form of little sort of plastic devices you can fix to a shirt, to a belt. But effectively what they enable the parent to do is to know where their child is at all times. I suppose I like this example because to me it contrasts so visibly with the example of the kids playing go-kart in the street. You might have known your kids started out in the go-kart outside your house, but who knew where they were going to end up? You clearly couldn't do that if you put an Angel Sense tracker on your child. Now, again, it's important to emphasize that all these devices, they are being sold to deliver important services that families seem to want. In this case, Angel Sense was started by the father of a child, I think with severe autism, certainly severe difficulties, and it was designed specifically so that the parent could give that child a bit more freedom, could let them go outside, could let them wander in a way that they couldn't if they weren't tracking them, right? So really, really well-intentioned. It advertises itself a bit like the last device, safety for children. Again, that phrase, peace of mind for parents. So many of these things seem to sell themselves on the basis of this sort of great idea, peace of mind for parents. I'm not sure I've ever had peace of mind as a parent, but maybe if I bought this, I would. I don't know. What does it require, though? Well, it requires, again, you track your child. Again, you choose when and where, I suppose, but in theory, at any point when they leave the house. You can log in, you can see where they are at any moment, you can check they are where they're supposed to be. This one I think is interesting, it's very hard to remove. I have had other children suggest that what you would do is you'd give your smartwatch to another child and pay them to take you where you're supposed to be. I think this is probably harder to game, but we probably could see that. So, again, what it's doing is it's normalizing this idea of surveillance, the idea that you get peace of mind by monitoring digitally your child. In the first case, monitoring what they're doing at school. In the second case, monitoring what they're doing online when they talk to their friends. And here, just monitoring where they are in the world. Again, very well-intentioned, but normalizing tracking and surveillance. And this is the last one. I suppose I like this again just because the advert itself, I mean, it makes you look like you're going to be married to Keanu Reeves, you're going to love more, you're going to worry less. This is something called an owlet sock, and it is a smart baby sock that you'd put on your infant when you put them in the cot at night, and it will monitor their blood oxygenation, it'll monitor their movement, and it connects again to an app and a base station, and I think it literally just lights change. So if there's anything to be alarmed about, if your child's measurements fall outside the norm, that light will alert you and you can intervene. Now again, in the old days, even when I had my kids, I would have found that out by going in and touching their head, seeing if they were hot, checking on them, listening for a cry. But clearly this is a more scientific and a more data-driven approach to that form of parenting. Interestingly, and it's a little aside, it is not a medical device. If you read the disclaimers on the website, it will tell you very clearly that it should not replace advice from a doctor, that you shouldn't rely on the data, and particularly if your child has all sorts of concerning complaints, again, don't use this. But the tagline is love more, worry less. I think the new one currently says rest assured, right? The idea you get more sleep if you use this. Interestingly, there's been a recent study, I think, by colleagues, I can't remember if it's King's College or UCL, I should check, which studied parents who were using the owlet sock. And did they find that parents were less anxious, that they slept better? No, actually the opposite. And again, maybe it's transitory, maybe it's a reflection of the fact that we're not yet used to this sort of digital monitoring. But the parents in those interviews, they worried more. They worried, was the internet down? Was the electricity going to work? Was the device working properly? And they didn't trust their own instincts. They trusted their instincts more than they trusted the device. So where does this take us? So for me, I suppose what all four of these products really do is they exemplify how parenthood is interacting with what we now call the data economy. You've got this perfect combination of parents who want to improve their parenting. Clearly they want peace of mind, they want sleep. We've got companies who want to develop new products so they can make a profit. And we've got children who are these perfect sources of data and information that can be developed and used by these products to provide that peace of mind for parents. So it's this wonderful sort of symbiotic relationship that it just seems to benefit all parties, it seems. But I suppose there's something quite strange about it that I feel we ought to spend more time thinking about. In the era where we were thinking about child digital safety, so those earlier slides I showed you, what we were really worrying about was the risks of children using the internet. But in these sorts of devices, it seems to me that what we should be thinking and reflecting about is the internet using children, right? So it's reversed. It's children's data that is being used to power these new tools, these new devices, to help parents make new and informed decisions. But it is the internet using children, it's not the other way around. And so I think we do need to sort of rethink the way that we look at online risks and harms. And ultimately, in that very first title slide, I gave you this weird phrase, the rise of the algorithmic child. A classic academic used a long word where a shorter one would have done. But I used that quite deliberately, and I think, Sonia, you gave me that phrase. It came from a colleague of yours, I think, at LSE, and she's not written it down, so I need to be able to sort of reference her in some way. But what do I mean by this? So for me, the algorithmic child is the idea that as parents, we are increasingly, or not just parents, in fact, as educators, as the state, we are increasingly making decisions about children based on their data, rather than based on the children themselves. If you think of what an algorithm is, it's a set of rules, it takes some data, it applies those rules, and it spits out a piece of information or a decision. And the products I showed you, that was being used in ways that supposedly benefit parents, in order to protect kids from online risks, to help you know where your child is, to help them progress at school, or perhaps to be more healthy. It's not even just the private sector. If I look at the use of children's data in the state at large, we see a system where increasingly social data science is helping welfare services to determine which children are at risk of harm. We see schools that are increasingly reliant on large-scale infrastructures and databases to do simple things like monitor the dinner queue, but also, importantly, to do things like generate assessments, analyze results, and devote school resources. So what we have in all these cases is a scenario where we see this rise of the algorithmic child, a move from relating to children, making decisions based on the child in front of us, the individual, perhaps even involving a sort of physical and intimate relationship, to making decisions based on data about them. Now, in the ideal world, the latter will just improve that relationship. It will be added to what we already have, and it will improve things for the family, for the child, and for the state. But I suppose my worry ultimately is that it won't augment and improve, but that it might replace. And that actually, in order to be a good parent in the future, you have to be the parent who monitors and who surveys and who tracks, rather than the parent who does that a little bit on top of checking where your child is, talking to them, going and touching their head. So I said at the beginning that this would be a sort of bird's eye view. I wanted us to reflect on where we'd come to with digital safety, and I want to suggest that we've got a little bit of a way to go, I think. But I also wanted to suggest that we need to go further than just thinking about digital safety, to thinking about the way in which these technologies might be, and our uses of them, might be reshaping some really fundamental things, like what it means to be a child, what it means to be a parent. And I think we need to check how we feel about that. Thank you very much. We have 15 minutes of questions, or comments, actually. It doesn't have to be a question. I don't think, we do have microphones, yes. So stick up your hand and grab a microphone. And if you could say who you are, that would also be great.
Go to this side.
Thank you.
First off, I want to thank you for a very, very interesting lecture.
My pleasure.
During the whole time that you were speaking, the one question that kept going through my head was, and it's a issue that my partner and I are struggling with now, is how does monitoring a child affect that trust relationship between the child and the parent? We have some concerns, but at a certain point, and the child is extremely bright, and we'll clock this very quickly, that we are doing monitoring. How do you think that's going to affect the trust relationship, not for me personally, but for everybody?
That is a good question. And again, as like most things, obviously it will vary from child to child and family to family. So actually I was interviewed by a journalist a few weeks ago who was doing some interesting research looking at grown children, so late teenagers and people in their early 20s, who were still allowing their parents to track them using things like Find My Phone or Find My Friends, etc. And that sort of slightly shocked me, actually, because I had precisely assumed that this type of monitoring, that it would be done, if you like, in a couple of periods. So one might be when your children are too young, really, to understand what that monitoring entails, but that actually, as a parent, you might feel that you really just need to do it without, if you like, their acknowledgement and their consent. And then there might be a difficult period, perhaps sort of tweens, early teens, where you really, really feel like you want to do that sort of monitoring, but that it would be almost impossible to do actually without their consent. And certainly during that period, you would have to somehow sort of negotiate some sort of truce if you really wanted it used, because it would be impossible to do it without their knowledge. But I'd sort of assumed that after, if you like, I suppose I'd assumed that that would be resented and there would necessarily be some sort of decrease of trust as a result of that. But yeah, what this sort of journalist was presenting me with, I mean, it's just anecdotal, it's not a research study, but with several examples of late teens, people in their early 20s, who'd got so used to the idea of sharing their location, particularly with their parents, they were quite happy for it to continue, and they didn't mind if their parents knew that they weren't sleeping in their dorm, at university, they were sleeping somewhere else. So, I think it's going to be very interesting to see. I mean, clearly, there is good research starting to be undertaken around how children's attitudes to privacy are being changed. But yeah, it's an empirical question. But like you, I could see it going either way, definitely. Thank you. It is Richard, isn't it? Yeah. Nice to see you. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, I'm Jackie, and a parent of 3 kids. And my question is, a lot of the examples that you gave were around monitoring or some type of interaction that happened because of an activity of the child or parent, but increasingly our children's biometric data is used at nurseries or even secondary schools here in the UK to pay for lunches or pocket money. Or there was the recent case of Flickr photos of children being harvested and used as training data for surveillance of faces and recognition. So while I understand there are unintended consequences of what's happening with the data that we somehow have some control over for that surveillance, where does the government or different organizations, like schools who are using this biometric data and maybe on computers that are connected to the internet, that they don't understand the long-term storage implications or risk, where does their responsibility start and end, and the government's versus ours as parents?
That's a really good question. So generally, when I'm thinking about data and surveillance, I would usually answer actually that I worry about it far more when it's undertaken by the state rather than individuals, simply because the classic definition of the state is that they have the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, effectively. Even if we think about the state operating within in a benevolent way, so like in the education system or the child welfare system, I do think we've spent so much time looking at what tech companies do actually that we've sort of missed the ball on this. There are some efforts afoot, for example, to try and understand what the digital infrastructure looks like, for example, say in schools. So we know that there are huge companies like Capita Sims who provide the digital backbone for these types of institutions. We know that they tend to work with tens, 20s of other companies to provide different bits of the digital service to those children. But that means I find it hard to believe that if I talk to the data protection officer in a school, that they could tell me exactly which bits of data about their children are going where, even to which country. Never mind, in a more granular level, exactly which bits of data and for how long, what purposes. So again, I don't think, it's not that I'd worry about this being used in a sinister way, but I think that like those examples that I showed you where data was being hacked, was being stolen, these companies that are providing these government services are just as likely to fall foul of that. And I think that, we need to focus some of the attention on state uses of collection of children's data, not just these ones I've mentioned here. So good question. Thank you. Let's have a look. So we have one from over here, and I'm going to come back to the gentleman in the blue jacket. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. It's really interesting. I work at Which, the Consumer Association, and I'm interested in all of what you were saying, but specifically the pieces about understanding harms. You quite rightly point out that a lot of the dodgy scenarios that you've found haven't actually resulted in harms today. I'm interested in your opinion on to what extent should policymakers start to think about potential future harms and how far out should we be looking?
Yeah, again, a good question. I think, so for example, I think we've got Tony Starr from the NSPCC here. If you look at the NSPCC website, they've updated their advice over the last year or two to ensure that they have a section, for example, on internet-connected devices in the home. And certainly one of the risks that it highlights is their potential for hacking or use by a third party without the knowledge of a parent. So I think that from a policy perspective, I think actually consumer organisations and children's charities, to be honest, have really sort of led the debate on what those risks are and raising awareness of them. I have many frustrations about the online harms white paper, but actually one of them is that it has enormous breadth, but it doesn't necessarily drill down into detail on some of the sort of areas where I think actually we're going to have these future harms arising. So I do think from a policy, a government perspective, we do need a bit more attention on some of these things. We've got it in the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, has introduced this new set of advice for designing products that are going to be used by children. That may make a difference. That's certainly a good first step, but we'll have to see where that takes us. Thank you. Gentleman over here.
Richard Verhard. I'm interested in the way that surveillance technologies distort our attention. It's because the technology companies say, we can monitor this aspect of your child's behaviour, therefore you should monitor that aspect. So they're choosing to surveil the easy bits for the things that they find easy. So that's distracting our attention from all sorts of other things as parents that we might have wanted to pay attention to. But we're persuaded that the things that the technology can monitor are the things that are most important to monitor, and that's not always true.
Yeah, I think that's a very good observation. I think there's a sort of a good piece of advice, I think it's one of yours, Sonia, actually, around how we think about things like screen time, for example, and actually we shouldn't worry so much about how long we're using a device for. Obviously, we worry about what we're using it for, but also what we're not doing while we're using it. And I think this opportunity cost approach is really beneficial for us as parents, you're right, as well as for children. So, yeah, when you're busy looking up the data about, your child's temperature and blood oxygenation last night, could you instead just be going in and sitting with them, or, reading them an extra story, or watching them sleep and so on. So I think it is a real concern, and I suppose it also reflects something I do think about quite a bit, which is that we're so focused on how we treat children, we're very rarely reflective of our own behaviours as parents or as adults generally. So I think, we do need to see more of that. Thank you. Gentleman here, and then can I go to the lady at the back, please? Thank you.
Hi, my name's Adam. I work for Sky. I have so many questions for you. It's such an interesting lecture, but I'll focus on one. I think as adults, we seem to be quite blasé in terms of protecting our own data and handing it over to companies. We seem quite relaxed about that. So some of the challenges you have highlighted for parents to be concerned about might be down the track a little bit. And certainly when I have seen focus groups with our customers, they seem less worried than you might imagine on some of the content, and definitely the privacy issues are a bit second order, and much more so on screen time. Yeah. And I know that it's controversial, looking at Sonia, but I'm interested to know, and you didn't really talk about it in your lecture, but the sense of friction that can cause in families and that parenting, childhood relationship. I was just wondering what your perspective on that was.
On screen time as a sort of parenting rule?
And not screen time itself as a harm as such, but just that dynamic in the family, because it does seem to lead to a lot of frictions and a fragmentation of family life.
So many of you may know I've got a super colleague, Isha Bilski at OII, who's done quite a lot of research on links between children's use of technology and the resultant harms to their mental well-being, their welfare, and so on. And certainly, from his perspective, screen time is one big red herring. It's just not correlated with any of the harms that we really worry about. He did a more interesting study, though, for this question a few years ago, which looked at the efficacy of different types of parenting technique in building resilience in children and how they use technology safely. And effectively, it compared two techniques. One is the sort of rule-based approach, whereby you set rules, whether that might be, you don't use this or that app or service, you only spend this amount of time online, versus the alternate approach, where you don't necessarily have such sort of set rules, but you talk much more to your children just generally about what they're doing, you keep in touch with them, you have a look, you see what they're doing. And the results of that study were certainly that the latter approach was much more effective in building children's online resilience. And so I suppose this is what I come back to, that I think not only do those discussions, those rule-based discussions, generate friction, which in itself is not a good thing in a family, I'm not convinced that we yet have the evidence, and we may not ever have the evidence, that they're yet even the most effective way of keeping kids safe online. So, again, I hold my hand up, I'm a parent and I do these things wrongly, but, I would always try to go for a non-rule-based approach versus a more communicative approach. Thank you. I think we've probably got time for about two more. There was a lady at the back with the microphone. Thank you.
Sorry, I've lost my voice a bit, so I hope you can hear me. But thank you, that was so interesting. So I have a question around some work I do. I work on period tracking apps and their privacy and some of the implications of their data flows. And I was wondering, I kind of think this could be interesting in that respect because one of the things that they're quite useful is in kind of developing understandings about your body and particularly for children, learning about those processes and also for making sure that things like stigma aren't, perpetrated and continuing. But also they have a lot of security issues, and I think a lot of the same kind of issues are kind of present within those apps. And they're also made by often quite small companies that might not then kind of adhere to things like GDPR and privacy policies like that. So I was wondering if you had kind of any thoughts about some of the risks that might kind of exist to children there, because often they pretend that 13 to 18-year-olds aren't using the apps, or under 13-year-olds aren't using those apps, but often they are. And maybe the role or kind of attitudes that parents might have to letting their child use that or not, or whether they know that that's happening or not.
So it's a big question. So there is, in the last week, we've had a code released by the Information Commissioner's Office, which is supposed to introduce, if you like, sort of new principles or new new guidance really for companies who are going to develop or are providing services which are likely to be used by children. Now, certainly one of the most difficult things that companies, particularly small companies, have to do is work out whether they fall into that category, and what does that likely to be used by children really mean? Does it mean you might have one child, or the majority of your users? So certainly there are still some unclarities around that guidance. But I think if you can get over that, actually, one of the things the ICO Code probably will be quite good for is providing some quite sort of simple principles. They are problematic in many other ways, but at the very least, I suppose they provide some simple principles you could at least look to as a starting point in thinking about whether or not you are building in, say, privacy by design into your app. I think, so we actually interviewed, for the research I was talking about, we interviewed some small companies, some startups who were designing apps and devices for kids. And to be honest, it was the moment when GDPR was on the horizon, but it hadn't been introduced. And this was their greatest source of concern. And it was simply that there wasn't a desire to be compliant, but it was so complicated that if you are literally sort of 3 people in a garage building something, you're supposed to be a lawyer, a legal expert, as well as an app developer. And I think, we are going to have to embrace that actually much more fervently in the next couple of years, because so much of our regulation is really complicated that if it's hard for somebody with, goodwill to ensure they're being compliant, then we're doing something wrong. You're hovering. Want to stop there?
Wonderful. Some fabulous questions, and please stay because we can have a drink and ask more questions if Vicky has time.
Definitely.
I'm eager to meet all of you. I'm especially eager to meet alumni. So if you're alumni here, please make sure to say hi before you leave. Please join me in thanking Vicky for tonight's talk.
Thank you.